What happens when an ordinary waitress drowning in debt and family heartbreak finally says no to a man who has never heard the word? She refused to serve the city's most arrogant and powerful billionaire, a man who could ruin her with a single phone call. Her manager fired her on the spot. But destiny had a twisted sense of humor. Less than 5 minutes later, that same billionaire was collapsing his priceless suit, no shield against a sudden violent death. He was on his knees, begging for his life, and the woman he had just humiliated was the only person in the crowded 5-star restaurant who held the power to save him. This is the story of that moment, and the impossible choice she had to make. The soft clinking of silverware on porcelain was the soundtrack to Phoebe Sullivan's life. It was a delicate, expensive sound that bore no resemblance to the frantic chaos of her reality. Here in the hushed, amber-lit opulence of Aria, Manhattan's temple of modern gastronomy, everything was designed to soothe the egos of the city's elite. The velvet chairs, the whisper-quiet service, the abstract art on the walls that cost more than her father's entire course of treatment. It was all a carefully constructed illusion of peace. For Phoebe, it was a battlefield. Her feet throbbed with a familiar deep ache that had settled into her bones over 1,000 shifts. Each step from the kitchen to the dining room was a small act of will. Her smile, the one professionally plastered on her face, felt like a lead weight. It was her armor and her cage. Tonight the armor was feeling particularly thin. Before her shift, she'd spent 3 hours on the phone with the hospital's billing department, navigating a labyrinth of codes, rejections, and condescending questions about her father's insurance or lack thereof. The final number they'd quoted had felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Now she had to glide through this sea of casual wealth, pretending that her biggest concern was whether a patron preferred their water sparkling or still. She had to listen to men in bespoke suits complain that their $300 steak was medium rare instead of the rare plus they'd requested, and nod sympathetically. She had to feign delight at their banal stories, her mind constantly crunching numbers, calculating how many plates of seared scallops it would take to afford 1 more week of her father's medication. Phoebe had once been on a different path. Her mind, sharp and inquisitive, had been devouring textbooks on human anatomy and pharmacology. She was 2 years into a pre-med program at Columbia, her future shimmering with the promise of a sterile, life-saving operating room. Then her father, a jovial high school history teacher who had raised her on his own, received his diagnosis. The aggressive form of lymphoma didn't just attack his body, it devoured their savings, their home, their future. Phoebe had dropped out, trading her scrubs for a black apron, the scent of antiseptic for the cloying aroma of truffle oil. The dream hadn't died. It was just in a medically induced coma, and Aria was its life support, dripping poison and pennies into her veins. "Table 7 needs you, Sullivan," hissed Mr. Henderson, the restaurant's manager. His voice was as slick and cold as the marble bar. "And for God's sake, look alive. You look like you're about to audit them, not serve them." Phoebe forced the muscles in her face to cooperate, pulling her lips into that familiar, hollow smile. "Right away, Mr. Henderson." Table 7 was a party of 4 celebrating some vague corporate victory. They were loud, self-congratulatory, and treated her like a piece of the furniture, gesturing for more wine without making eye contact. She refilled their glasses, murmured, "You're welcome," to the empty air, and retreated. The night wore on a monotonous cycle of orders, smiles, and clearing plates. It was just after 9 o'clock when he walked in. The low hum of conversation in the dining room seemed to falter for a moment, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Nathaniel Blackwood did not simply enter a room. He conquered it. He was a titan of real estate and tech, a man whose face was a regular fixture on the covers of business magazines, usually under headlines like "The Midas of Manhattan" or "The Billionaire Bulldozer." He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark grey suit that probably cost more than Phoebe's car. His hair was dark and styled with a casual precision that took immense effort. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. They were a sharp, cold grey, and they swept across the room with an air of dismissive appraisal, as if he were inspecting a property he was considering demolishing. He was not alone. A stunningly beautiful woman, Tiffany, dripped from his arm, her dress a shimmer of sequins, and her laughter a high, tinkling sound that seemed to annoy even him. Trailing a step behind was a younger man in a suit that was trying too hard, his face a mask of eager sycophancy. Mr. Henderson practically teleported to the entrance, his usual stiffness melting into a posture of profound deference. "Mr. Blackwood, what an honor. We weren't expecting you this evening." A last-minute decision, Henderson. Blackwood said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. He didn't look at Henderson, his gaze still scanning the room. "I trust you have my table." He spoke of it as if it were a permanent fixture, a throne awaiting his return. "Of course, sir. Of course. Right this way." Henderson led them not to a regular table, but to the most coveted spot in the restaurant, a secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the city lights. It was known as the Throne among the staff. As they passed, Phoebe felt a prickle of unease. She had served her share of celebrities and magnates, most of whom were either professionally polite or blissfully oblivious. But Blackwood radiated a different kind of energy, a predatory stillness, a palpable arrogance that seemed to suck the oxygen from his immediate vicinity. Henderson scurried back towards the sommelier station, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Sullivan," he barked in a harsh whisper, "you're on the throne tonight. Don't screw this up. He's a stickler. Don't speak unless spoken to. Anticipate everything, and whatever you do, do not get his order wrong. The man could buy this building and fire us all for sport." Phoebe's heart sank. This was the last thing she needed. Serving Nathaniel Blackwood was like performing surgery under a microscope while being judged by a hangman. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and grabbed 3 leather-bound menus. The smile was back, heavier than ever. She approached the table with practiced grace. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm and even. "My name is Phoebe, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with some—" Blackwood cut her off without looking up from his phone, raising a single dismissive finger. Tiffany was busy taking a selfie, angling her phone to catch the sparkle of her diamond earrings. The young associate just stared at Blackwood, waiting for a cue. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. Phoebe stood there, a statue holding 3 menus, feeling her professional veneer begin to crack. The humiliation was a small hot coal in her stomach. He was making it clear that her existence was subject to his whim. Finally, after typing out a message with one thumb, he placed his phone face down on the table with a soft click. He looked at her then, and his cold grey eyes weren't just indifferent. They were dissecting. He wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing a function, a pair of hands to bring him things. "We know what we want," he stated. Not asked. "A bottle of the 98 Cheval Blanc, and don't let the sommelier try to upsell me. I know the inventory better than he does. Tiffany will have the lobster risotto. Preston," he gestured to the young man, "will have the filet medium. I'll have the Dover sole, pan-seared, no sauce. Deboned at the table. Be quick about it." He hadn't opened a menu. He hadn't asked his guests what they wanted. He had decreed it. Phoebe maintained her composure, her pen poised over her notepad. "An excellent choice, sir," she said, the words tasting like ash. "And for you, miss?" she asked, turning to Tiffany, affording her a courtesy Blackwood had not. Tiffany looked up from her phone, blinking. "Oh, what did he say I was having? The lobster risotto, miss." "Oh, right. Yes, that. And a Cosmo." "Make it a double." Phoebe jotted it down. As she was about to turn away, Blackwood spoke again, his voice laced with a casual cruelty that was somehow worse than overt anger. "And you," he said, his eyes flicking from her face down to her slightly worn black shoes and back up. "Try to look a little less like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. It ruins the appetite." The remark landed with surgical precision, striking right at the heart of her exhaustion and despair. It wasn't just an insult, it was a trivialization of her entire struggle. He saw her pain not as a human condition, but as an inconvenience, an aesthetic flaw in his dining experience. In that instant, something inside Phoebe Sullivan snapped. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, seismic shift. The lead-weight smile didn't just fall from her face. It shattered. The years of swallowing pride, of enduring condescension, of nodding and scraping for a meager tip to keep her father alive, it all coalesced into a single unyielding point of resistance. The armor was gone, and what was left was pure, unadulterated steel. She met his gaze, and for the first time all night, her eyes were not the hollowed-out windows of a service worker. They were clear, focused, and utterly devoid of fear. The silence that followed Nathaniel Blackwood's comment was a living thing. It expanded, pushing against the ambient chatter of the restaurant, creating a bubble of intense stillness around the corner booth. Preston the associate shifted uncomfortably, his sycophantic smile frozen in place. Tiffany, oblivious, was still admiring her selfie. Blackwood himself leaned back slightly, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes, clearly unaccustomed to his words not being met with immediate, fearful compliance. He had expected her to stammer an apology, to scurry away with her tail between her legs. He did not expect Phoebe to stand her ground. She slowly, deliberately lowered her notepad and pen to her side. Her posture straightened, not in a gesture of defiance, but of simple, unassailable dignity. The servile slump that came with the apron was gone. She looked him directly in the eye, and the emptiness was replaced by a quiet fire. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily within their bubble of silence. "What did you just say to me?" The question was not accusatory. It was a simple, direct request for clarification, which made it all the more powerful. It forced him to acknowledge the callousness of his own words. Blackwood's lips thinned into a smirk, a mask for his momentary surprise. "I said," he enunciated slowly, as if speaking to a child, "that your miserable expression is unappetizing. This is a place of leisure, not a soup kitchen. If you can't manage a simple smile, perhaps you're in the wrong line of work." Preston let out a nervous chuckle, a pathetic attempt to curry favor. Tiffany finally looked up from her phone, a vague frown creasing her perfectly smooth forehead. "Nathaniel, be nice," she murmured, though it held no conviction. Phoebe felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear of being fired, the gnawing anxiety about her father's bills, the sheer weight of it all, it was still there, but it was no longer in control. It was as if she had been holding a massive, precarious stack of plates for years, and in this moment she had simply decided to let them fall. The crash would be terrible, but the freedom of letting go was intoxicating. "My miserable expression, as you call it," she said, her voice remaining level, "is the result of a 17-hour day that began at a hospital and will end long after you've gone to sleep in your penthouse. It is the face of a person who is working to keep a family member alive. It is not an accessory to your meal. Each word was carefully chosen, a polished stone dropped into the still water of his arrogance. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't crying. She was stating facts, and her calm delivery was more damning than any outburst could have been. Blackwood's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark glower. He was not a man who was spoken to this way ever. He was the one who defined the terms of every interaction. I don't pay $5,000 for a meal to listen to the sob story of the help. You're right, Phoebe agreed, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. You don't. You pay for food and for service. She took a small step back from the table. You will receive neither from me. Preston's jaw literally dropped. Tiffany gasped a theatrical little sound. Nathaniel Blackwood stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning rage. It was a look that had made corporate boards tremble and competitors capitulate. It had no effect on Phoebe. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I am refusing you service," Phoebe stated plainly. "I will not be your waitress tonight. I am certain one of my colleagues will be happy to take over. Enjoy your meal." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away from the table. It was the longest walk of her life. Every nerve ending in her body screamed that she was committing career suicide, that she was throwing away the very job she so desperately needed. But her feet carried her forward with a resolute certainty. For the first time in years, she felt like the person she used to be, the one who believed in principles, the one who hadn't yet learned that dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford. She hadn't taken 5 steps before Mr. Henderson was on her, his face a mottled mask of panic and fury. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, Sullivan?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "That is Nathaniel Blackwood. Do you have any idea who you just spoke to?" "I do," Phoebe replied, pulling her arm from his grasp. "And I'm afraid I can't serve him, Mr. Henderson." "You can't?" Henderson looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. "You don't have a choice. Get back to that table and apologize. Grovel if you have to. Now." Blackwood was now standing, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the booth. He was watching them. His arms crossed, a look of cold fury etched on his handsome features. The entire section of the restaurant had fallen quiet, patrons, pretending to read their menus while their ears were trained on the unfolding drama. "No," Phoebe said simply. "I won't." "That's it," Henderson snarled, his face inches from hers. "You're fired. Get your things and get out. You are finished in this city. I will personally see to it that you never work in another reputable establishment again." The words, which would have terrified her an hour ago, now felt strangely hollow. "I understand," she said, a profound weariness washing over her. She turned and began walking towards the staff locker room in the back, her movements measured and deliberate. She could feel every eye in the room on her back, most of all Blackwood's. She could feel his rage, his wounded pride, his sheer astonishment that a nobody, a waitress, had dared to defy him. As she passed his table, she didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the swinging doors to the kitchen. But she heard him speak one last time, his voice dripping with venomous condescension directed at Henderson, but meant for her. "See that you do, Henderson," Blackwood said. "Some people need to be reminded of their place in the world." The kitchen doors swung shut behind her, cutting off the muted sounds of the dining room. She was enveloped by the familiar cacophony of clattering pans, shouting chefs, and the hiss of the grill. She leaned against the cool stainless steel wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She had just detonated her life. There was no job, no income, and the mountain of debt was now a volcano. And yet beneath the terror, there was a spark of something she hadn't felt in a very long time: self-respect. She slowly made her way to the small, cramped locker room, took off her apron, and folded it neatly, placing it on the bench. As she changed out of her uniform and into her street clothes, jeans, and a worn-out Columbia sweatshirt, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a cold dread in its wake. What had she done? How was she going to tell her father? Her hands were trembling as she gathered her purse. She took one last look around the small room that had been her prison for the last 2 years. Then she pushed the door open to leave, ready to face the consequences, to walk out of Aria and into an uncertain, terrifying future. But the scene she walked into was not what she expected. Chaos had erupted in the pristine, orderly world she had just left behind. Phoebe pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, expecting to make a quiet, ignominious exit through a side entrance. Instead, she was met with a scene of utter pandemonium. The hushed reverence of the dining room had been shattered. Patrons were on their feet, craning their necks. Staff were frozen in place, trays in hand, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. At the center of it all, at the corner booth that was his throne, Nathaniel Blackwood was in distress. He was half standing, half slumped over the table, one hand clutching at his throat. His face, moments ago, a mask of cold fury, was now rapidly turning a blotchy, alarming shade of red. A strange, high-pitched sound wheezed from his lips with every desperate attempt to draw breath. It was the terrifying sound of a body betraying its owner. Tiffany was shrieking a useless, piercing sound that did nothing but amplify the panic. "Nathaniel! Oh my God, what's wrong? Somebody do something!" She flapped her hands near his face, careful not to get too close. Preston, the associate, was fumbling with his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he couldn't seem to unlock it. "I'm calling 911. I'm calling 911," he repeated, more to convince himself than anyone else. Mr. Henderson had rushed to the table, his face ashen. "Mr. Blackwood." "Sir, can you breathe? Is he choking?" He looked around wildly, his managerial authority having completely evaporated in the face of a real crisis. "Does anyone know the Heimlich maneuver?" A few waiters started forward hesitantly, but it was clear no one knew what to do. The scene was a perfect storm of wealth, helplessness, and escalating terror. Phoebe stood by the kitchen door, momentarily rooted to the spot. Her first instinct was a cynical, bitter thought, karma. The man who had just tried to ruin her life was now choking on his own arrogance, or perhaps on a piece of overpriced bread. A dark, ugly part of her wanted to turn around, walk out the door, and never look back. He deserved it. He had treated her like something less than human, and now his mortality was on full public display. But then the pre-med student in her, the part of her that she thought had been buried under years of exhaustion and resentment, took over. Her brain began to analyze the scene with a cold, clinical detachment that bypassed emotion. He wasn't choking. The wheezing sound strider was a classic sign of upper airway obstruction. His face wasn't just red. It was developing hives, angry welts blooming on his neck and jawline. His hand wasn't just at his throat. He was scratching at it frantically. And his lips. Phoebe's eyes narrowed. They were starting to swell a condition known as angioedema. It wasn't choking. It was anaphylaxis, a severe, life-threatening allergic reaction. Time seemed to slow down for her. While everyone else was caught in a vortex of panic, her mind became a quiet, orderly place. She scanned the table. He hadn't even eaten yet. The bread basket sat untouched. The wine hadn't been poured. So what was the trigger? Cross-contamination. Something in the air. Her gaze fell on a small complimentary dish of spiced nuts that had been placed on the table when they arrived. Blackwood hadn't touched them, but perhaps the oil had aerosolized, or he'd inadvertently touched them, and then his face. It could be anything, but the diagnosis was almost certain. And with anaphylaxis, every second was critical. The swelling in his throat would close his airway completely in a matter of minutes. "He's not choking," Phoebe's voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't loud, but it was filled with an authority that made everyone, including Henderson, turn to look at her. "Sullivan, I told you to get out." Henderson snapped his panic, making him vicious. "He's having an allergic reaction," she said, ignoring him and taking a step towards the table. "A bad one. We need an EpiPen. Now. Does anyone have one?" Her question was met with blank stares. People fumbled in their purses and pockets, but the frantic search yielded nothing. An epinephrine auto-injector was not something most people carried unless they had a known severe allergy. Blackwood's condition was deteriorating rapidly. He was no longer making any sound at all, his chest heaving with useless, silent effort. His eyes wide with primal fear locked onto hers. In their grey depths, she saw not the arrogant billionaire, but a terrified man staring into the abyss. His arrogance, his power, his billions. They were all meaningless now. He was just a man who couldn't breathe. "Call 911 and tell them it's suspected anaphylactic shock with airway compromise," she commanded, her voice sharp. She looked directly at Preston. "Tell them they have less than 3 minutes." The command galvanized the terrified associate into action. He finally managed to dial his phone, relaying her words with a shaky voice. Phoebe moved towards the table, her mind racing. No EpiPen. Paramedics were minutes away, but he didn't have minutes. His airway was closing. She could see the cyanosis beginning to creep into the edges of his swollen lips, the bluish tint that signaled a critical lack of oxygen. His brain was being starved. Soon his heart would stop. She was no longer Phoebe Sullivan, the fired waitress. She was Phoebe Sullivan, the Columbia pre-med student who had aced her anatomy and physiology exams, who had spent late nights studying emergency medical procedures she never thought she'd have to use. She reached the table and looked down at Nathaniel Blackwood. He was sinking to his knees now, his body going limp. His eyes were still on her, and in them was a desperate, silent plea. The man who moments ago had wanted to remind her of her place in the world was now begging her with the last of his consciousness to save his life. Henderson grabbed her arm again, harder this time. "What are you doing? You're a waitress. Don't touch him. You'll be liable." Phoebe shook him off, with a strength that surprised them both. "If nobody touches him, he'll be dead." She shot back, her voice like ice. "He has maybe 60 seconds. She knelt beside Blackwood, her brain working faster than it ever had before. She could see the anatomy in her mind's eye, the larynx, the trachea, the cricoid cartilage. She remembered a lecture on emergency airways, a procedure so drastic it was rarely performed outside a hospital, and even then only in the most dire of circumstances. A cricothyrotomy, creating a surgical airway through the neck below the level of the swelling. It was incredibly dangerous. One slip of the hand could sever an artery or cause permanent damage. And she wasn't a doctor. She wasn't even a student anymore. If she failed, he would die, and she would go to prison. But if she did nothing, he would die for certain. She looked at his terrified, pleading eyes one last time. In that moment, he wasn't Nathaniel Blackwood, the cruel billionaire. He was just a patient, and she was the only one in the room who knew how to treat him. The choice was brutal, stark, and entirely hers. The world had narrowed to the space between Phoebe's eyes and Nathaniel Blackwood's gasping throat. The shrieks from Tiffany, the panicked shouts of Henderson, the distant wail of a siren beginning its journey through the city, it all faded into a dull, irrelevant roar. All that mattered was the ticking clock of oxygen deprivation. Blackwood was on the floor now, slumped against the velvet upholstery of the booth. His powerful frame, which had seemed so intimidating just minutes ago, was now just dead weight. The expensive suit was rumpled, his silk tie askew. His face was a terrifying mask of mottled purple and red, his eyes bulging with the sheer animal panic of suffocation. He was drowning on dry land. His gaze was locked on Phoebe. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the primal need for air. The condescension, the power, the billions all stripped bare. What was left was pure, unadulterated desperation. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a beggar. His eyes, pleading and wide with terror, were begging for his next breath. His life was in the hands of the woman whose dignity he had tried to crush for sport. The irony was so thick, so profound, it was almost a physical presence in the air. Phoebe felt a sudden, dizzying sense of vertigo. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. She held his life in her hands. She could stand up, walk away, and let nature take its course. It would be a simple, passive act. No one could blame her. She was a fired waitress, not a doctor. Henderson himself had ordered her not to touch him. She could watch the man who had humiliated her expire on the floor of this temple of excess, and the world would call it a tragedy, not a choice. The dark, wounded part of her whispered that it would be justice. But the healer within her, the part that had driven her to study medicine in the first place, screamed in protest. It was the part of her that was an extension of her father, the man who taught her that every person had a story, that empathy was not a weakness, but the highest form of strength. She looked at Nathaniel's purpling face, and she didn't see an enemy. She saw a human being in his final terrifying moments. She saw a closing airway, a failing respiratory system, a brain being starved of oxygen. "Help! Me!" The words were not spoken. They were a strangled, gurgling thought that she could read in his eyes as his consciousness began to fade. "Stay with me." Phoebe's voice was sharp, a command. She placed her fingers on his neck, feeling for the landmarks she had only ever traced on anatomical dummies and in textbooks. The thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple. She slid her fingers down into the soft depression just below it, the cricothyroid membrane, a thin layer of tissue between cartilage rings, the target. It was horrifyingly small. "What are you doing?" Henderson shrieked, finally finding his voice again. He lunged for her, but one of the other waiters, a young man named Carlos, who had always been kind to her, put a hand on his chest, holding him back. "Let her work," Carlos said, his own face pale with fear, but his eyes full of trust for Phoebe. "She's going to kill him," Henderson wailed. "He's already dying," Phoebe said without looking up, her focus absolute. "I need a knife, a sharp one, and a straw, a hollow tube of some kind. Now." Her command cut through the panic. People scattered. Tiffany just stood there weeping. Preston was still on the phone, babbling incoherently to the 911 operator. A busboy no older than 19 reappeared at her side. "A steak knife?" he asked, holding it out with a trembling hand. Phoebe glanced at it. Serrated. No good. It would tear the tissue. "No, something with a clean edge. A paring knife from the bar, and the tube from a ballpoint pen. Empty it out." The busboy nodded and sprinted towards the bar. Phoebe tilted Blackwood's head back, extending his neck to make the target clearer. His breathing had stopped entirely. His chest was still. His eyes were beginning to glaze over. He was gone or close enough that it didn't matter. "Don't you die on me, you son of a bitch," she muttered under her breath, the words a strange prayer of profanity and desperation. She pressed her knuckles hard into his sternum, a pain stimulus to try and keep his brain firing for a few more seconds. There was no response. The busboy was back, pressing a small, clean-bladed paring knife and the hollow plastic tube of a pen into her hand. They felt alien in her grasp. One was for slicing lemons, the other for taking orders. Tonight they were surgical instruments. She positioned the tip of the knife over the cricothyroid membrane. Her own heart was hammering against her ribs, so hard she felt it in her teeth. The weight of the decision was immense. This is it, she thought. The point of no return. She was about to slice into the throat of one of the most powerful men in New York City with a bar knife and a pen tube. The sheer insanity of it was staggering. Henderson was now openly sobbing, a pathetic, broken sound. The liability. My God, the lawsuit. Phoebe ignored him. She looked at Nathaniel Blackwood's face. The life was fading from it, the vibrant, cruel energy extinguished. He was a shell. This wasn't about saving him anymore. It was about refusing to let death win. It was about honoring the oath she had never had the chance to take. She took a deep, steadying breath, held it, and made the incision. The moment the knife broke the skin, a collective gasp swept through the onlookers. The sound was sharp, visceral. Phoebe felt it more than she heard it, a wave of shock radiating from the silent, staring crowd. Her entire world had shrunk to a 1-inch patch of skin on Nathaniel Blackwood's neck. There was no room for error, no time for hesitation. Her hand was surprisingly steady. The years of exhaustion, the trembling anxiety that had become her constant companion, all of it vanished, burned away by the pure, cold focus of the task. This was what she was meant to do. In the fluorescent-lit anatomy labs of Columbia, she had been good. Here on the plush carpet of Aria, with a man's life literally at her fingertips, she was perfect. She made a small horizontal incision, just as the textbook described, about 1/2 inch wide. There was a welling of dark venous blood, but not the bright, pulsing spray of an arterial bleed. A good sign. She had missed the major vessels. She then turned the knife and made a second vertical cut through the membrane itself, a quick, precise stab. There was a faint pop as the blade pierced the tough tissue and entered the trachea. An airway. The sirens were louder now, screaming closer. They were a countdown clock. The pen tube. She said her voice, a low command. She didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the small, bloody opening she had created. The busboy who had remained kneeling on the other side of Blackwood slapped the hollow plastic tube into her waiting palm. Her fingers, now slick with blood, carefully inserted the tube into the incision. She pushed it gently downwards into the windpipe, aiming it towards the lungs. It was a makeshift cannula, a desperate, flimsy straw to a drowning man. Now came the moment of truth. Had it worked? Was the blockage truly above the incision? Had she created a viable path for air? She lowered her ear to the open end of the pen tube. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing but the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears. Then she heard it. A faint, wet whistle. The sound of air being drawn in. A breath. It was ragged, shallow, but it was a breath. She put her mouth over the tube and gave 2 small, steady puffs of air, watching his chest. It rose. It actually rose. Air was getting into his lungs. "He's breathing," she whispered, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her. She felt a tremor go through her hands, the adrenaline threatening to betray her, now that the most critical part was done. "He's breathing." A ragged cheer went up from some of the staff. Carlos the waiter let out a sob of relief. Henderson had slumped against a nearby table, his face buried in his hands. Phoebe continued to assist his breathing, giving small puffs of air every few seconds, her mind a mantra of, "Stay calm, keep him going." Blackwood's color began to change. The terrifying purple and blue hues started to recede from his lips and face, slowly being replaced by a pale, waxy grey. It wasn't healthy, but it wasn't death. It was life, hanging by the most tenuous of threads. The front doors of the restaurant burst open, and 2 paramedics rushed in, followed by another 2 carrying a stretcher. They were a whirlwind of professional calm efficiency in the midst of the civilian chaos. "What do we have?" The lead paramedic, a woman with short-cropped hair and stern, focused eyes, asked as she knelt beside Phoebe. Phoebe didn't relinquish her position. "Male, late 40s. Suspected severe anaphylaxis, unknown trigger. Airway was fully compromised. I performed an emergency cricothyrotomy." The paramedic's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she took in the scene, Phoebe in her civilian clothes, leaning over a billionaire, breathing into a pen tube sticking out of his neck. She quickly checked his carotid pulse. "He's got a thready pulse," she confirmed, then looked at Phoebe with a new level of respect. "You did this?" "I had to," Phoebe said simply. "He was agonal." The paramedic nodded sharply. "Okay, let's get him on oxygen and a monitor. We need to intubate and get this airway secured." Her partner was already setting up equipment. They worked with a seamless, practiced rhythm, attaching ECG pads to Blackwood's chest, taking his blood pressure, and preparing an IV line. The lead paramedic took over for Phoebe, using a small bag valve mask to deliver pure oxygen through the makeshift airway. Phoebe finally sat back on her heels, the transfer of responsibility leaving a sudden void. Her hands were covered in Nathaniel Blackwood's blood. A small, dark red stain was spreading on the knee of her jeans. She looked at the man on the floor. His eyes were closed now, his body limp as the paramedics worked on him, but his chest was rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He was alive. She had done it. She had performed a surgical procedure from a textbook with a bar knife and saved a man's life. The enormity of it finally hit her. Her whole body began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor as the adrenaline crash landed. The paramedic stabilized him quickly, expertly replacing her pen tube with a proper endotracheal tube, administering a shot of epinephrine into his thigh and starting an IV drip. Within minutes, they had him loaded onto the stretcher. As they were about to wheel him out, the lead paramedic paused and looked down at Phoebe, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring at the blood on her hands. "You're not a doctor?" the paramedic asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a question laced with disbelief. "No," Phoebe replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I used to be a pre-med student." The paramedic stared at her for a long moment. "Well, you should have been a surgeon. You just saved his life. Not many people could have done that. Not many would have had the guts." She gave Phoebe a final appreciative nod and then turned to follow her team as they rushed the gurney out of the restaurant, the siren wailing once again as it sped away into the night. The dining room was a wreck. Overturned glasses, discarded napkins, and the lingering scent of fear hung in the air. The patrons were being ushered out by the remaining staff. The police had arrived and were beginning to take statements. Phoebe slowly, stiffly got to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly. She was aware of people staring at her, whispering. She was no longer invisible. She was the waitress who had just cut a man's throat to save him. Mr. Henderson approached her, his face a pale, sweaty mess. He looked at her as if he'd never seen her before. The fury and contempt were gone, replaced by a bewildering mix of awe and terror. "Sullivan." "Phoebe," he stammered. I don't know what to say. You saved him." Phoebe just looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Listen," Henderson continued, wringing his hands. "About what I said before. A mistake. A terrible mistake. Firing you. That was just the pressure of the moment. Of course your job is safe. You can come back tomorrow. We'll forget this whole thing ever happened." He was offering her back the apron, the condescension, the soul-crushing routine, as if it were a reward. He thought he could erase the last hour, erase the insult that had started it all, erase the fact that she had been forced to save the life of her own tormentor. Phoebe looked from Henderson's pathetic, pleading face to the dark red smear on the carpet where Blackwood's head had been. She thought of the cold dismissal in Blackwood's eyes and the desperation that had replaced it. She thought of her father lying in a hospital bed and the dream she had been forced to abandon. She had faced death tonight. She had held a life in her hands and refused to let it go. Going back to serving overpriced steak and swallowing insults was no longer an option. It was impossible. She had been someone else in those critical moments, someone she had forgotten she could be, and she wasn't going to let that person go. "No thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I quit." She turned, walked past the stunned manager, past the gaping police officers, and out the front door of Aria. The cool night air hit her face, feeling like the first breath after being underwater for too long. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know how she would pay her bills. But for the first time in a long, long time, Phoebe Sullivan was free. The next 2 days passed in a blur of surreal exhaustion. Phoebe felt like a ghost haunting her own life. After giving a brief, factual statement to a bewildered police detective, she'd taken the subway home, her blood-stained hands hidden in her pockets. In her small apartment, she scrubbed them raw, but she could still feel the phantom stickiness of Nathaniel Blackwood's life on her skin. Sleep offered no escape, her mind replaying the night's events in a chaotic loop, the cold contempt in Blackwood's eyes, the horrifying wheeze of his closing throat, the sickeningly small pop as the knife broke through the membrane. She'd wake up with her heart pounding, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. The story, of course, was everywhere. It had gone viral. "Waitress saves billionaire's life in restaurant horror," screamed one headline. "Angel of Aria, the unlikely hero of Park Avenue." Read another. The news painted her as a fearless saint, a flawless heroine. They didn't mention Blackwood's cruelty or that he'd had her fired moments before he collapsed. The world had consumed a simple, clean narrative that bore little resemblance to the messy, morally complex reality she was living. Her name was everywhere, but she had never felt more invisible. Reporters camped outside her building, forcing her to sneak in and out through a back entrance. She visited her father at the hospital, forcing a cheerful smile as she recounted a fabricated, boring shift. She couldn't tell him she was unemployed, let alone how it had happened. The weight of the secret was almost as heavy as the events themselves. By the third morning, the numbness gave way to the cold, hard edge of reality. Her rent was due. A new bill from the hospital sat on her kitchen table like a coiled snake. The heroism the world celebrated didn't pay the bills. A new, terrifying thought began to creep in. What if Blackwood sued her? He was alive, but she was an untrained civilian who had performed a dangerous surgical procedure. A man like him didn't see heroes. He saw assets and liabilities. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. A sharp knock on her apartment door made her jump. Reporters. She held her breath, willing them away. "Ms. Sullivan," a calm voice called through the door. "My name is Arthur Finch. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Blackwood. I assure you I am not a reporter. Nathaniel Blackwood. This was it. The lawyers had arrived. With grim resignation, she opened the door to a man in his late 50s, with kind eyes and a simple suit. He looked more like a professor than a hatchet man. She let him in. Mr. Blackwood became fully lucid yesterday evening. Finch began foregoing pleasantries. His first order of business was to find you. On his behalf, I am here to extend his deepest, most profound gratitude. His doctors were clear had you not intervened, he would not have survived. Phoebe braced herself for the but. He is also aware, Finch continued, his tone somber, of the full context of the evening. He knows what he said to you. He knows that he had you fired. He placed a thick envelope on her coffee table. This is a formal apology written by him, and a severance check from the restaurant for $50,000. Phoebe stared at the envelope. It was a fortune. It was also hush money. I don't want his money. She said the words automatic. Finch nodded, as if he'd expected this. He suspected as much. He said you had a different kind of currency. He retrieved a large folder from his briefcase. He asked me to do some research about Columbia, your pre-med, track your father's medical situation. You had no right, Phoebe began, feeling violated. He felt he had no right not to. Finch interrupted gently. He needed to understand the person who saved him. He opened the folder. Mr. Blackwood believes debts must be paid. His debt to you is incalculable. This is his attempt to settle it. He has instructed his foundation to pay off your father's entire outstanding medical debt. Furthermore, the foundation has endowed a full scholarship in your name to the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. It covers everything. There are no strings attached. Phoebe sank onto her sofa, her legs giving out. She stared at the papers. It was her entire dream, resurrected from the dead and laid at her feet by the man who had nearly destroyed her. Phoebe sat in stunned silence, her gaze fixed on the folder. The offer was a miracle, and a curse, a lifeline from the man who had tried to drown her. Her pride, the same fierce instinct that had made her quit, warred with the overwhelming pragmatism of the solution before her. How could she build her future on the foundation of her own humiliation? The answer came in a quiet, painful image, her father's face etched with worry lines he tried to hide, burdened by the knowledge that his illness had destroyed her dreams. Could she truly punish him and herself to make a point to a man who had already learned his lesson in the most brutal way possible? Was her pride worth more than her father's peace of mind? Arthur Finch's voice cut through her turmoil. He explained this wasn't charity. It was a debt Blackwood felt he could never truly repay. For the first time, the billionaire saw that true value wasn't in a stock portfolio, but in the skill and compassion of a person he had deemed worthless. This was his attempt to right a universal wrong. The logic was undeniable. This was bigger than her wounded pride. This was about her purpose. Slowly, decisively, Phoebe slid the folder across the coffee table toward herself. "All right," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept." When Finch gestured to the envelope containing the $50,000 check, she shook her head. "Donate it," she said, "to a fund for medical students who are struggling, so someone else can get a second chance, too." After he left, Phoebe stood by the window, the documents in hand. The city outside hadn't changed, but she had. A new path had been forged in the crucible of one impossible night. She was not a victim or a waitress. She was Phoebe Sullivan, and she was going to be a doctor. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story. It's a powerful reminder that dignity isn't something that can be bought or sold, and that true strength is often found in the quietest, most unexpected places. Phoebe's story shows us that a person's worth is never defined by their job title or their bank account, but by their character and the choices they make under pressure. It's a testament to the idea that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the catalyst for our greatest triumphs, and that second chances can appear when and where we least expect them. What would you have done in Phoebe's shoes? Would you have helped the man who had just humiliated you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and make you think. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.